The Canadian Armed Forces have seen a steady degradation in government support and capabilities since the Suez Crisis, culminating in the 1968 unification, setting both the Department of National Defense and the forces down a path of government apathy and negligence. Since arguably before Confederation and the idea of Canada as a sovereign state, those who'd eventually go on to call themselves Canadians, or, depending on the time, actual Canadians themselves, would begin a tradition of military excellence. Whether in 1812 or the Fenian raids, all the way up to the Boer War and the forging of Canadian identity in the fields of France in World War I. The Canadian military as an institution has seen various eras of immense success and critical stagnation. In this project, I aim to broadly analyze to the best of my ability exactly what challenges the modern Canadian Armed Forces appear to be facing and why, beginning with the historical context and moving into the modern day. I would like to note that I'm not a subject matter expert and draw from information that is open source and public. This part I'll try to keep as brief as possible since it's a topic which has been discussed 1,000 times. The 1931 Statute of Westminster was one of Canada's last steps to complete independence, with it ensuring legislative equality, or the ability to make its own laws in contradiction to Britain, and giving it control over its foreign policy. A significant step forward, as during the First World War, and really every conflict before it, Canada didn't really have a say in the matter of going to war. It was much more of a situation where Britain told Canada to jump, and we responded with how high. This newfound semi-independence was put to the test in 1939 with the breakout of the Second World War, where, when Britain and France declared war on Germany on 1 September, Canada, under Mackenzie King, decided to wait 1 week before making their own declaration, a move largely symbolic but nonetheless representative of the new state of affairs in the country. The start of Canada's true involvement in the war was slow and difficult, with the country's first major actions being the defense of Hong Kong, which, though a valiant effort, was put up by units such as the Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles of Canada, in addition to units from Britain, India, Hong Kong, and China, was ultimately unsuccessful in the face of insurmountable odds, as Japanese numerical and local technological superiority eventually wore down Allied troops. Then there was Operation Jubilee, the 1942 Dieppe Raid, an unmitigated disaster in planning and execution, which left 907 Canadians killed, 2,460 wounded, and 1,946 taken as prisoners of war. That means that less than half of the Canadian soldiers who departed for the operation successfully made it back to the UK. Despite these early war losses, the Canadians weren't about to throw in the towel and would later see significant victories and progress made, such as during the Italian campaign, where they fought across Sicily and the rest of Italy, pushing Axis forces back, or during the Battle of the Scheldt, the liberation of the Netherlands, Juno Beach on D-Day, during the Battle of the Bulge, or countless other engagements. What can be plainly asserted is the growth of an immensely capable, experienced, and strategically relevant Canadian military, with the Royal Canadian Navy by the end of the war, depending on what sources you use, being between the fourth and fifth largest navy in the world, though certainly in part influenced by many other major navies being artificial reefs, not dissimilar to the Moskva by that point. Canada continued to find itself positioned in various conflicts following the conclusion of the Second World War, including the regrettably often forgotten Korean War, in which over 30,000 Canadians served, and saw the establishment of the borders of the Korean Peninsula that still persist today. In a conflict that is so vast and interesting that it almost seems more apt to think of it like an additional DLC pack to the Second World War rather than as one of the many other post war regional conflicts. Regardless, I'm hoping to cover it in depth someday. Besides Korea, Canadian forces also contributed significantly to NATO during the Cold War, with the anti submarine warfare expertise of the country being of particular note and value during that era of great power competition. Canada and the Cold War is also something that I would really love to talk about if I ever get the chance to do so. There's also the 91 Gulf War, controversial operations in Somalia, Balkan operations, Afghanistan, and much more. In the modern day, Canada finds itself in an extremely different threat environment than it faced during the Second World War, though I would argue that the echoes of the Cold War have, in many ways, returned. With the largest land war in Europe since World War II having broken out in 2022, with the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, alongside a resurgent in China and conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, the world almost seems too much like a powder keg for comfort. So, how is Canada responding to this? Not very well. Since Cold War heights of nearly 4.2% of GDP allocated to defense spending, Canada has seen a sharp decline in allocation of funds to national defense following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the peace dividend. This is, however, understandable, as this trend existed in just about every NATO member state following the end of the Cold War. As it turns out, when there's no visible threat, people generally want government funds going to things like, education and healthcare rather than investing in advanced artillery and air defense systems. Who would have thought? However, even after the events of 2014 with the Little Green Men in Crimea, there still has been a continued drop in allocation of GDP to defense since about 2017. 2020 notwithstanding, likely due to the economy itself shrinking. I'm going to note upfront that I'm not an economist, so this section is going to be extremely surface level in terms of an analysis, though I believe that is still too important to not at least mention. According to NATO, Canada's defense spending, was just 1.29% of GDP in 2023, a continuance in the trend up to that point. This is around the point where government officials start to begin to point to major procurements such as the F-35 program, National Shipbuilding Strategy, and NORAD investments, all tabling in the billions of dollars. As nice as those capital expenditures are, they are still exactly that, capital expenditures. The actual operating and maintenance budgets of the Canadian forces, the budgets that affect the everyday troops the most, continue to shrink year after year, and in fact, a billion cut was announced just prior to the new year. Many people often like to jump straight into the topic of the NATO 2% benchmark, which I don't necessarily believe is the only way to look at this issue. If Canada is able to contribute meaningful, combat ready forces that can contribute significantly to modern threat environments that the Canadian Armed Forces is likely to become engaged in, then percentages become almost pedantic. Unfortunately, that's also not really the case. Regrettably, when it comes to a discussion on the lacking capabilities of the Canadian military, the question is usually, where do we start? A Rusi report commissioned by the Department of National Defense was leaked in 2023, and amongst other things, it stated that the Royal Canadian Air Force's fleet of CF-18 Hornets are, quote, not credible in a NATO context against many of the higher-end mission sets, unquote. This is alongside stated radar limitations and a dubious readiness rate for the aircraft. It turns out that when your equipment becomes old enough to have grandkids, problems start to arise. Though, while all elements of the force are suffering, the RCAF actually does seem to have some light at the end of the tunnel. The procurement of the F-35 is a major step forward for Canada, and with deliveries expected sometime in the late 2020s, it should be one of the first major steps to getting things back on track for the armed forces. There's also the sole source procurement of the P-8 Poseidons to replace the CP-140 Aurora fleet for maritime patrol and ASW, which is coming about as late as it can, since Boeing was about 2 days from shutting the line down. At any rate, it's very positive since as aircraft age, spare parts can become much more difficult to source, regardless of how excellent the bird might be. There's also the Airbus A330 to replace the CC-150 Polaris in its role as an air-to-air refueler, which is a capable aircraft in use by many of our allies, such as the USAF, RAAF, and RAF. However, what good are aircraft without people to fly them? This is another issue faced by the modern RCAF. With a shortage of experienced pilots and a massive training backlog, any attempts to renew the Royal Canadian Air Force's fleet will run into certain difficulties until this issue can be credibly mitigated. This will fall under our later discussion on personnel, so we'll put a pin in that for the time being. So, what about the Navy? Well, if I said more of the same, except with less positivity, I think that would pretty concretely sum it up. The Halifax-class frigates are a class of multi-role patrol frigates introduced in 1992, making the oldest of the class now around 32 years old. Canada operates 12 of these frigates, which, while multi-role, as stated before, placed an emphasis on their ASW capabilities, in line with the history of the RCN during the Cold War, and really even back to the Battle of the Atlantic. The armament of this class is comprised of Harpoon ASMs, Evolved Sea Sparrow anti-air missiles with a 57mm, Phalanx Sea-Whiz, and anti-submarine torpedoes, seeing it suited for ASW work and limited anti-shipping operations. Again, one of the main problems here is age, as these ships are really getting no younger. and with the first of the Type 26 frigates, their replacements, not scheduled to be delivered until the 2030s, the Halifax class is going to be held together with duct tape and prayers as they limp along as Canada's principal and only surface combatant ships. The dire state of affairs was made even clearer in a video posted to the actual official RCN YouTube account, where the chief of the Royal Canadian Navy himself said that one MARTEC, or maritime technician, leaves the Navy every 2 days. For a Navy of less than 10,000 regular force members, skilled members leaving en masse is about the same level of severity as the gates of hell opening and the world turning into doom in real life. Ships can always be built, even if it takes time, though the loss of institutional knowledge will cripple a force if not taken care of. Regarding Canada's most strategically important asset, the Victoria-class submarines, they also face a plurality of issues that warrant their own discussion entirely, though I'll try to sum it up in the following way. Subs broke. The Royal Canadian Navy is perhaps the most stressed of all the elements in the Canadian Armed Forces, as the government's new Indo-Pacific strategy has forced an already stretched Navy to do even more with even less. Amongst other things, the strategy outlines that Canada will augment its number of frigates that it deploys to the region, noting that it will do so by, quote, investing in military operations, unquote. Investments which I'm sure every sailor is biting their fingernails in anticipation of, and that I'm sure will arrive sometime between now and the heat death of the universe. Right now, there seems to be some sort of misconception that you can continue to task people to do more with less, with aging, broken equipment, in increasingly dangerous scenarios indefinitely. This is not true, and this is how you end up with catastrophic losses when something eventually goes wrong. In the wake of the Ukraine war, most, if not all, Western militaries are likely to be in a state of force structure evaluation, seeing what works, what doesn't, and identifying capability gaps. In this section, I would like to go over some of those perceived capability gaps for the Canadian Army and explore why exactly they are so important. The Air Defence Anti-Tank System, or ADATS as the cool kids call it, is, as stated by the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum, a quote, dual-purpose, short-range, surface-to-air anti-tank missile system which used laser-guided supersonic missiles alongside an electro-optical sensor, end quote. ADATS was introduced to the Canadian military in 1989 and served a relatively short and uneventful service life, with its retirement in 2012, in true Canadian style, being without replacement. This means it has been over a decade since the Canadian Army has fielded a ground-based air defense system. Given the modern threat space is so heavily saturated with drone warfare and other air threats, take your pick of where in the world you'd like to look for examples, whether it's the Houthis in the Red Sea or the Russians in Ukraine. There's no doubt that any participation in the conflicts of the 21st century requires a significant and capable anti-air element to ensure that you even have a baseline ability to operate in the environment that you wish for your forces to be deployed. As of now, Canada is reliant on the assets of other NATO partner states to provide air defense, which limits the options for the country in terms of independent troop deployment and sustainment in theaters with a possibility for air threats. This problem has not fallen entirely on deaf ears, however. As of 2023, the Canadian Army has issued the fast tracking of air defenses for the Canadian led NATO EFP Latvian battle group as an urgent operational requirement, or UOR, with the previous, more large scale but slow procurement seemingly still being on track for the awarding of a contract in 2026. The introduction of a ground based air defense system to the Canadian Army will mark a significant step forward in terms of the flexibility and self reliance of the force, bringing back a massive capability that will enable increased participation in higher threat environments. In terms of what systems I believe are likely to be fielded, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Hardy of the Canadian Army stated that the system will be a short-range one, alongside a mobile counter-drone system. If I was a betting man, I'd say the Norwegian NASAMS is a likely contender, though that would mostly be pure conjecture. While the Canadian Army may not be necessarily known as a prolific operator of main battle tanks, it nonetheless maintains a moderately sized fleet of relatively modern, though aging, Leopard 2s of German origin, being the 2A4, 2A4M, and 2A6M, alongside other engineering and support variants. Prior to 2023, Canada had around 82 Leopards of the previously mentioned combatant and training variants, though 8 were donated to Ukraine to fight against the Russian invasion. This leaves Canada and the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps in a bit of an awkward spot, as now that previous number of 82 has been reduced to 74. Of course, not all of those 74 are going to be usable at the same time due to maintenance requirements, and tanks are incredibly maintenance intensive. So the question at this point is one of replacement and the capability that the Government of Canada sees the armed forces of the nation playing in the future. If Canada is to place an increased emphasis on the usage of tanks and other armored vehicles, possibly something along the lines of CB90s to complement or replace the LAP 6, then the necessary funds are going to need to be allocated to support this goal. In terms of a replacement for the 8 tanks donated to Ukraine, as usual, things seem to be moving at the speed of government, and very little public progress seems to have been made as of yet. However, Canada has deployed what I believe to be a doctrinal Squadron Minus of Leopards to EFP Latvia, which at least demonstrates that the country isn't entirely abandoning the idea of the tank, as was proposed by Rakilia during the Afghanistan years. The number of 74 Leopards doesn't leave much in terms of flexibility and scale for the Canadian Army in terms of usage in operations. If we go off the number of 15 tanks per squadron, that gives us just shy of 5 full squadrons worth of tanks. When you consider the fact that approximately 42 of those 74 tanks are generally reserved for training, according to the Canadian Army, that doesn't really give you much to work with. The question at this point becomes, what do we want the Canadian tank force to be? For a comparison to some of our allies, the French have around 222 Leclercs, and the British have around 213 Challenger 2s. An allied nation with a similar current quantity of tanks to Canada would actually be Australia with 59 Abrams. As things stand, Canada does not have, at least in my view, a significant number of tanks to stand prepared for a possible high-intensity conflict in the near future. If the government sees a continued relevance for tanks in the Canadian military, then we should strive for greater than a one-to-one replacement of the donated Leopards and instead bolster the force alongside a modernized doctrine to ensure continued relevance of the Canadian Armored Corps, allowing greater flexibility in overseas deployments with other Canadian assets. If they decide the tanks are no longer worth investing in, then we should stop with the half measures and barely keeping an increasingly shrinking fleet limping along. A persistent debate is on the relevance of tanks, and whether or not they even still have a purpose in contemporary warfare. While I will ultimately defer to the experts, I would say that given Canada has already changed its mind once about divesting the capability, and that, if anything, the war in Ukraine shows just how important having an armored capacity is to strategic relevance on the battlefield, I think it will be a very long time before the tank disappears for good, and Canada would do wise to maintain and expand this capability. There are other elements of the Canadian Army that are frankly lacking and that I would like to talk about, such as an absence of self-propelled artillery and various logistics issues. However, I will move on in the interest of time, and hopefully at some point these topics can get a spotlight of their own once I've had time to properly research them. You could have all of the fancy, high-end equipment in the world, though if you lack the people to maintain and operate said equipment, well, you don't have much of a force. The Canadian Armed Forces has an authorized personnel count of 71,500 regular force and 30,000 reservists for a total of 101,500 troops. However, the forces are dealing with a shortage of over 16,000 individuals, according to National Post, though the real number is suspected to be possibly somewhat higher. As ordered by General Wayne Eyre, the Canadian Armed Forces entered a period of supposed reconstitution with a goal of halting non-essential activities so as to reconstitute the military and bring it closer to that authorized personnel level while stopping the bleed that is the retention rate. As it stands, the Canadian military simply does not have the numbers to carry out the various expectations of it, which are operation and training obligations across the world, domestic and otherwise. Recently, the Defense Minister Bill Blair stated that the Canadian Armed Forces will continue to participate in domestic disaster relief operations, commonly falling under the banner of Operation Lentis, an intensive operation that often sees hundreds of CAF personnel tasked across the country to help in civil disaster relief situations. While it is great for the military to help Canadians in times of need, the Army has very quickly gone from being the last resort to the first choice of the provinces due to their lack of investment in provincial level disaster relief capabilities. According to Global News, between 2020 and 2022, there were approximately 157 calls for federal support involving the military from the provinces. Operations like Lentis do not go without strain to the armed forces. Every time the military is required to dedicate much of its already extremely finite resources to domestic disaster relief, that is time and energy taken away from other important activities. Often, there is simply no way to do both. This means less training, less personnel available for other operations, and a degradation of other skills and capabilities. There's additionally the creation of a public and government perception that the military is somehow Canada's FEMA, when this should not at all be the case. This is not a problem unique to Canada, as even the Australian military has become increasingly relied upon in recent years to help that country with disasters such as bushfires and flooding. What I'm not trying to say is that the military should never participate in domestic disaster relief. Rather, it should be that it's truly the last resort, and Canada should instead look to the creation of a separate disaster response agency, something perhaps along the lines of the United States' FEMA, which, according to some reports, may actually be in the works. The personnel problem expands beyond just disaster relief, with other major factors such as housing and pay being extremely and likely much more relevant. According to the CBC, as of 2022, there were just shy of 4,500 CAF members and their families who were on wait lists for military housing, with only 132 new units having been constructed in the 5 years prior. Now, I don't believe I have to state why exactly 132 new housing units over the course of 5 years is a bad thing, but if you're struggling to understand, let's just say that it likely places some soldiers in a situation where they're having to decide which is more comfortable, sleeping in a cardboard box with a pillow or in a van by the river. It actually got so bad that at one point members of 19 Wing in Comox, BC were told to contact Habitat for Humanity to help find housing. I wish I was making this up. Add to this a new housing differential system, which will actually see 7,700 CAF members cut off from their existing housing allowances. This problem of housing merely aggravates and fuels the retention issues of the military, and forced moving every few years uh, eventually just begins to take a toll on individuals and their families, and especially so when you are unable to guarantee that the member and their family will actually be able to find a place to live. The Canadian military is actually one of the highest paid in the world. However, this is of little consolation due to the fact that Canada is also an extremely expensive place to live. Further, the aforementioned forced moves and frequent lack of spousal employment opportunities merely seeks to amplify this issue of living affordability. The Canadian Armed Forces seems largely to be attempting to handle this crisis through a strategy of filling a bucket of water with a hole in the bottom with more water faster than the water can spill out. As clumsily as I worded that, that is to say, it seems to be a mostly recruitment focused strategy rather than a retention focused one. This can be seen through new endeavors such as the Naval Experience Program, acceptances of degrees in lieu of taking the aptitude test for certain trades, and more. While obviously both elements are absolutely important, there just seems to be much less effort put into maintaining those already in the forces, those individuals with specialized skills and with experience. We previously spoke about how one MARTEC leaves the Navy every 2 days. That is a retention issue and a very serious one. In the end, only time will tell how things evolve, though as they stand, the situation is not good. Where did this military atrophy originate from? How exactly did we get to where we are today? Well, the Suez Crisis can be blamed, or thanked, depending on your perspective, for the admittedly fading image of Canada's armed forces as a global peacekeeper. The 1956 crisis would see Western Division as the United Kingdom, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal from the country under President Nasser, after Egypt enabled martial law and seized control in response to the United States and Britain refusing to finance the Aswan High Dam due to Egypt's strengthening ties to the Soviet Union. This event would see international condemnation of the French, British, and Israelis, including by both the United States and the USSR. And I don't think I have to state just how badly you have to blunder to have both the Americans and Soviets actually agree on a geopolitical issue. Anyways, archivist, you might be asking, what does this have to do with Canada? Well, just about everything, actually. And it starts with Lester B. Pearson. Pearson was Canada's foreign affairs minister at the time of the crisis and championed for the first large scale United Nations peacekeeping force, stating in a quote to the General Assembly, Peace is far more important than the ceasing of fire. A UN vote for the peacekeeping mission would pass, and though initially ignored by the French and British, since I suppose they were just interested in seeing exactly how far in a hole they could dig themselves at this point, they would eventually concede and allow peacekeepers into the Canal Zone. The United Nations Emergency Force was commanded by a Canadian general and that of E.L.M. Burns, alongside the supply and logistics contingents, which were also composed of Canadians. This was really the start of the Canadian peacekeeping myth, being that Canada's military is, and has always been, a bunch of blue beret wearing peacekeepers, when this hardly reflects reality. Although, following the Suez Crisis, the Canadian military did begin to see an increased participation in the ever increasing UN missions, such as in Cyprus, the Congo, Israel, Syria, and more. Ultimately, I believe that this growing perception of Canada as a peacekeeping nation would over time engender a sense of indifference towards the major warfighting capacity of the armed forces, with Canadian society progressively viewing the military more as peacekeepers than a force which should maintain a capability for high-end, near-peer conflicts. The image of the Canadian Army that stormed Vimy Ridge was all but gone. Today, this image still exists, though is really nothing more than a shadow of a bygone era, with Canada having had less than 60 armed forces members deployed on peacekeeping missions worldwide as of 2023. Yet the damage has been done, and a significant portion of the Canadian population is still likely to only see Canada's military as UN peacekeepers. The 1968 unification of the Canadian Armed Forces is a massive topic, well deserving of its own video. However, I will do my best to tie relevant aspects of it to the overall subject of this video, so forgive me for being able to only cover cursory aspects of it. In essence, it saw the erasure of three services of the armed forces, being the Army, Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, as distinct legal entities, with them now all falling under the organization of the Canadian Armed Forces, which would later be named the Canadian Forces, and then in 2013, reverting back to Canadian Armed Forces. Not at all confusing, I know. They were also replaced by 6 commands, being Mobile Command, Maritime Command, Air Defense Command, Air Transport Command, Material and Training Commands. All services were forced to wear dark green uniforms, erasing the previous element-specific ones and disregarding the traditions and history behind them. A common rank structure was established across the entire military as well. Now, I should state that tradition should never stand in the way of genuine evolution and necessary changes in force structure and modernization. But so much of unification seemed to be changes for the sake of changes, merely to justify reorganization. What was advertised to be a reorganization for the benefit of efficiency had begun to go far beyond that. The man behind it all was Paul Hellyer, who was largely motivated by political ambition such as cutting costs and a desire to become the Prime Minister of Canada. The cutting cost part made the military an easy target since it took up nearly a quarter of the national budget. It was the go-to option. Many of these changes ended up being reverted, probably because of how much they sucked, and eventually the elements got their legacy titles restored, separate service HQs were reestablished, and various other changes were reversed as well. Unification was extremely unpopular in the military, and several senior officials resigned once the changes had been enacted. In the end, unification did save money, though saw very minimal gains in terms of increasing the actual effectiveness of the military, with certain positives such as the streamlining of certain administrative processes being largely overshadowed by the financial hit the military took. It was only 2 years after unification that Canada's last aircraft carrier, HMCS Bonaventure, was decommissioned. The effects of unification can still be felt to this day, and for many, the damage to the military has been in many ways irreversible. Okay, now for the elephant in the room. Or, in this case, it's really more like the blue whale in the room. The Canadian military sucks at procurement. In Canada, late and over budget, or just not getting things entirely, is the norm. While I would like to leave it to those more experienced in this matter than I am to explain why exactly this is, I would like to highlight an example of a top-tier Canadian military procurement blunder, just to demonstrate how poorly a job we do. No, I would not be starting with the Ross rifle, though I probably could go even further back than that. The C295 Kingfisher is an aircraft purchased by the Government of Canada to replace the existing search and rescue fleet of Buffaloes and Hercules aircraft that the Royal Canadian Air Force was operating. Unfortunately, the C295 kinda sucks at search and rescue. Since its inception, the program had been plagued with issues, and the initial operational capacity of the aircraft had to be pushed from summer 2022 to sometime in 2029 to 2039. Yeah, this has forced the Royal Canadian Air Force to task its already quite small fleet of Hercules to pick up the slack, stretching thin resources even thinner, as is par for the course. Some deficiencies with the aircraft were stated to be in relation to cockpit avionics and various other unforeseen technical challenges that have resulted in a 10-year delay from the initial timeline. I think the only country that could give Canada a run for its money in terms of who's worse at military procurement would have to be Germany, and even then, it would be too close for comfort. Some closing thoughts. I believe that right now, the Canadian Armed Forces are in a bit of an identity crisis. A lot of this manifests through the current defense policy, strong, secure, engaged, which is a bit of an ironic title, which manages to say so much and yet so little in regards to the actual desired force structure and capabilities of the Canadian military. Until a clear path can be outlined and supported for the Canadian Armed Forces in the 21st century and beyond, one that recognizes the evolving threat environment and is willing to go beyond vague statements of capacity investments to instead outline a concrete path and role for Canada to play in the world as a strategically relevant middle power capable of influencing multi-regional geopolitics, I have a feeling things are going to get worse before they get better. Let's hope that the defense policy review that's promised in 2022 actually sees the light of day. Who knows? Maybe things will change after all.